Today, we're continuing our story of Disney artist Herb Ryman. In our episode today, we'll take a look at how New Orleans Square and Pirates of the Caribbean came together. Specifically, how their design represented a change in direction for Walt and WED, and how both of these developments were based on research in contemporary cities, New Orleans of course, but also San Juan, Puerto Rico. As Disneyland developed over years, Walt's artistic gaze began to shift. The initial inspiration for Disneyland was, of course, Hollywood films and Hollywood studio backlots. Next came a period where Walt wanted to create areas that were based on American history that functioned largely as sophisticated living museums. In the early 1960s, Walt became interested in using his park to showcase aspects of near-future living, and after that, Walt started to explore how real-world cities could become the inspiration for lands or even attractions. And that is where we are now. That is, the design structure of Disneyland changed regularly so that by the mid-1960s, Disneyland wasn't just one thing, such as a place to celebrate the world of film. It was now many things all working together. But before we get to all that, I need to thank another round of new Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, and these here are the people who keep all of this going. Today, I want to thank A.B. Thompson, L.J. the Guide, ZZ Man, Prim Planner, Bruce, Mitchell, Amy, You Get Back Up, and Tim. Thanks to each of you and to all of our Bandcamp subscribers for supporting what we do here. And now let's kick into the show. After the death of his mother, Herbie found himself more fully drawn into the social life of WED. WED gave his life a community. Its offices were filled with artists largely from live-action studios who now worked on projects for Walt. These were people who, like himself, had devoted their lives to art, people who typically had studied studio art for years before finding their first job. Herbie had centered himself in this world in the creation of beautiful images made by his brush, pen, and pencil. But the joys of these pursuits didn't fully protect him from the tragedies of life. By the time the fingers of grief started to release him, he found himself in a slightly different place, one where his main family connections were with his sisters, though now both Lucille and Christine were involved in their own struggles. At middle age, they were both focused on and to some extent struggling with careers and money. At work, artists around him understood his loss. They were sympathetic and saw how the death of his mother had affected him. During these months, work continued on 3 attractions for the New York World's Fair. By the time Herbie was again engaged, much of the attraction planning was finished. Show stages and animatronics were being built, with an eye toward shipping them by truck to New York early in 1964. But much to the surprise of Ryman and other artists, these 3 attractions, along with supporting installations and host pavilions, wouldn't be the only elements that Disney would create for the fair. In February 1963, a few weeks after Cora's death, Pepsi-Cola approached Disney with a proposal to create one more attraction, one that Pepsi would underwrite, but would benefit UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Relief Charity. The attraction, earmarked for one final plot of unused land at the fair, would present the children of the world and speak to a diversity of international cultures. Pepsi, who sponsored the Golden Horseshoe Review at Disneyland, didn't approach Walt directly, but instead worked through their business connections at the park. They talked with Joe Fowler, who oversaw construction for Disneyland. He said that WED was already overtaxed with their current assignments, but he took the proposal to Walt. When Fowler suggested that, in his opinion, due to the tight timeline and their current workload, they should pass, one of Walt's eyebrows lifted with an expression of irritation. "I'll make those decisions," he said. "Tell Pepsi I'll do it." Days later, Walt arranged for a planning and feasibility study to be completed for the Pepsi UNICEF Pavilion with an eye toward making quick, simple design choices to complete a full pavilion in under a year. But the feasibility study was a mere formality, as Walt liked the proposal so much that even though he was charging $1 million to Ford and General Electric for the promotional use of his name in association with a wet attraction, he waived that fee for the Pepsi ride since it benefited UNICEF. Once an agreement was in place, Walt told his employees, "There's one more piece of real estate left at the World's Fair. I'd like to put a ride there." Specifically, he wanted to build what he called a little boat ride. In a fair dominated by corporate and government exhibits, most of which were focused on a preview of new consumer products or displays to promote tourism, this little boat ride would be one of the few attractions entirely focused on a cultural message without a strong overlay of commercialism. Initial designs for the attractions worked their way through WED. Initially, animator Mark Davis, best known for his work on the characters Maleficent and Cruella de Vil, inked out designs, figures of children arranged on different stages. Walt, however, didn't warm to his vision. Instead, he asked Mary Blair, a designer who had previously worked as a concept artist and color stylist for the animated features, to develop character and stage designs, a series of whimsical vignettes in which children would radiate innocence and goodwill. The brilliance of her designs were largely focused on two areas. She was able to suggest similarities in children throughout the world from a diverse range of racial and ethnic backgrounds by reusing character proportions for each figure. In this way, her designs reinforced the attraction's basic theme, that children from around the world shared not only similar environments, but also similar goals, desires, and longings. Her watercolors presented stages on which mechanical children, each about 2 feet tall, exuded kindness and warmth. During the initial months of design, Ryman was largely focused on his family, arranging a second memorial service for his mother in Decatur, Illinois, and then taking her remains to Arlington Cemetery in Virginia. By the time he was focused again on WED, he was starting to feel more like himself. As he reviewed the conceptual designs for Small World, he noticed some elements that were shockingly similar to his own suggestions for Space Station X1, an attraction in Tomorrowland that offered guests a satellite view of America. 8 years earlier, while X1 was under construction, Ryman had suggested that Walt place dolls across North America to show the diversity of lifestyles and cultures, a suggestion that Walt rejected, claiming that, at least in attractions, he hated dolls. As far as Ryman was concerned, Blair's designs were an unusual adaptation of his idea from 1955, but instead of dolls representing the cultures of North America, they represented the cultures of the world. While discussing these designs with Walt, he stretched his mouth into a thin line, as he often did when he was about to make a wry remark. "I thought you hated dolls," he said. Walt did not respond. Perhaps he didn't need to, as not long ago, when discussing Liberty Street and its relationship with Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, he'd explained that he reserved the right to change his mind. Still, Ryman sensed that he'd found an inconsistency in Walt's plans that in some small way shifted a little more social power in his direction. Walt did not ask Ryman to work on the Pepsi attraction itself. Instead, he directed Ryman to draw up concepts for the entrance courtyard. The other Disney-designed attractions, particularly the Ford Magic Skyway and the General Electric Carousel of Progress, were housed in architectural showpieces, unique buildings that functioned as artistic marquees for the wonders inside. The Ford Pavilion was in a rotunda surrounded by concrete ribs, and the General Electric Pavilion was in a massive dome which at night was dramatically illuminated by colored lights. Small World, due to its late entry, would be housed in a quickly produced building made of corrugated metal, something that the operations team would later refer to as the barn. Because of this, Walt wanted a traditional ride marquee placed in front of Small World, something that could be seen from a distance. For this, Walt looked to Herbie, who had created concept drawings for the entrance to Tomorrowland, Liberty Street, Fantasyland, and many other areas in Disneyland. "I was assigned to do some of the entry areas for Small World," Ryman said. But as Ryman's work slanted toward the realistic, his designs did not match the sense of whimsical fantasy that filled the actual ride. "I didn't do very well with that," Ryman confessed. "My ideas didn't seem to mean very much, and Walt at that period brought in designer Rolly Crump to do the big marquee." Crump, whose personal aesthetic was far less attached to realism, created a 120-foot tower with carousel platforms of characters and colorful propellers. Like an enormous kinetic toy, the tower was visually connected to the themes of youth inside the attraction. During the final months of planning for the fair, Ryman's most significant works were paintings of futuristic living that would be presented in the GE Pavilion. The thesis of the GE Pavilion was the promise of the near future, a time when inventions would improve the quality of life for all Americans. The Carousel of Progress depicted how electrical appliances had transformed the home in the first half of the 20th century, and the final stage previewed appliances that were then being developed by GE. After the show, guests could explore images of domestic life in the near future, with many houses transformed by electrical wonders. Ryman's paintings, as always, presented Walt's ideas in visual form, just like a decade earlier, when he'd drawn the first unified bird's-eye map of Disneyland. Only now these images spoke to a more powerful dream, a world of greater comfort, ease, and efficiency, even if no one knew exactly how these future conveniences would work. Ryman knew how to handle this assignment, the mix of concrete details and speculation. "The key," he explained, "was to be specifically vague." By which he meant that in WED paintings he only worked specific detail into certain elements, leaving other areas somewhat open, thereby allowing a viewer to fill them in as they saw fit. When Ryman finished his work on the fair, Walt again directed him back to Disneyland. Walt approached him in his office. "Oh, well, Herbie, I guess you've forgotten about New Orleans Square, haven't you?" Ryman laughed a little, as he'd been too busy on other assignments to even consider it. "Yep," he said. "Oh, what's the matter? You guys had an assignment, you've done nothing." That's absolutely right," Ryman said. "There won't be anything done either, as long as we have to listen to Tommy Walker." Walt's face wrinkled with confusion. "What the hell has Tommy Walker got to do with it?" "Oh, well, Walt," Ryman began, "he's got everything to do with it. He wants a dance floor, and you gotta give him a dance floor because you gave him power to tell us what to do with New Orleans Square, and nothing is ever going to happen except a dance floor." "Well, hell," Walt huffed. "Forget Tommy Walker." "If I can forget Tommy Walker," Ryman said, "I'll show you how to do New Orleans Square by tomorrow afternoon." "Do you mean that?" Walt said. Ryman, who was still seated, leaned back in his chair and looked up at Walt. "I know how this thing ought to look. I know how it ought to be. If you come back here tomorrow afternoon at about 3:30, I'll show you what New Orleans Square ought to be." "All right, Herbie," Walt said. "I'll be back here at 3:30. I won't forget that, and you'd better have something." After Walt left, Ryman worked on some loose sketches that depicted how he, rather than Tommy Walker, envisioned a New Orleans Square. In this, he was again expanding his abilities. Most of the images he made for WED were an adaptation of his work as a set designer. He drew or painted a scene as guests would see it as they arrived, like a vision on a movie screen adapted into dimensional space. But now he experimented with how a land should be laid out, how guests should move through it, and the ways a well-designed space would provoke curiosity and wonder. "It should be a maze, a labyrinth of streets," Ryman told himself. "And when you come out, you're on the New Orleans waterfront, just where you started." Through this, he was moving beyond concept designs to layouts that suggested a type of master planning. The following day, as Ryman recalled, Walt arrived at 3:30 to look over his plan. It was a layout for the entire area, from the mansion, which was already constructed, down through Magnolia Park and a plot of land that was then earmarked for a pirate exhibition. He had a rough drawing of New Orleans with the streets that go in, and you make a curve and you come out, and you're surprised you're right back on the riverfront again. Ryman didn't yet have full facades or buildings, but he had a concept of how the area might be developed. The drawings not only showed an early visual arrangement for New Orleans Square, but a layout design that considered how guests might use this area, much like the designs of an architect or a city planner. Walt saw that, and he liked it, Ryman said. In the months that followed, Ryman made multiple trips to New Orleans to study the city in an attempt to bring its essence to Disneyland. For Ryman and the other WED designers, this type of research was a new approach to park designs. Early themed areas at Disneyland were largely based on images in film or sections of studio backlots, from the western sets of Frontierland to the period drama sightlines of Main Street to the Hollywood jungle in Adventureland. But now Walt's design gaze wasn't on film or even on history. It was on the contemporary world, with the goal of realistically replicating part of Louisiana inside of a California theme park. Small touches of this approach had previously been used at Disneyland, most notably with the Matterhorn. Walt had wanted the Disneyland Mountain, or at least the upper portions with its iconic chimney peak, to resemble the actual Matterhorn in Switzerland. But for this, Walt had sent designers postcards of the Matterhorn. Designers also used images printed in National Geographic, and from them they designed the Disney Matterhorn, first in paintings and later in a series of models. But now, Walt wanted his team to explore New Orleans with an eye toward creating a new themed land that closely resembled the actual city. In 1963 and 1964, Walt regularly traveled between Burbank and New York to coordinate with the fair. He also traveled to Florida to discreetly explore possible locations for a second Disneyland, something that at that time was often called either Project X or Disneyland East. They flew in a Grumman Gulfstream, a corporate plane recently acquired by Walt, a modest craft capable of carrying up to 15 passengers. The plane held couches, a conference area, and one desk, a type of working office that moved from city to city. These trips gave Walt and his designers opportunities to repeatedly visit New Orleans. The trips included architects and landscapers, as well as those who specialized in interior designs and dressing sets. During one of these trips, shortly after touching down, Walt, Lillian, and his companions learned that John F. Kennedy had been shot, which was a piece of news that shocked everyone on the plane. Walt, who leaned Republican, said, "I didn't vote for Kennedy. This is too a tragic thing." A pall came down around them, a sense that they were wired to a common tragedy. They had dinner, then stayed at the Royal Orleans Hotel, located at the end of the French Quarter. Built in 1960, the Royal Orleans was a new high-rise. On its top floor were windows that allowed Walt, Ryman, and other designers generous views down into the quarter and also of the Mississippi River, whose dark water moved through the center of town. The grandeur of this view, in small ways, slowly began to wash the sorrow of Kennedy's death from their minds. By the following day, Walt and his team were ready to work. They spent time in Jackson Square and the French Quarter, particularly those narrow streets such as Pirates Alley that were thickly lined with shops. They examined everything from architectural styles to plants, from color palettes to wrought iron balconies whose curly-Q designs unfolded like flowers, fruit, and even stalks of corn. They noted the arrangement of shop windows, also elaborate wooden doors that in some areas led to courtyards arranged with brick floors and potted plants. On the river was a steamboat that offered tourists a tour of the area, and on the streets were horse-drawn buggies and carriages, but Disneyland already had both of these. Beyond the beauty of the historic quarter, some elements suggested the disarray of a large city. A mishmash of store signs filled tourist areas, such as Papa Joe's Bar, Dixieland Jazz, Regal Beer, American Bank, and Folk Music Shop, none of them unified in terms of design or color. A few courtyards were overgrown with plants and weeds, the pavement was uneven in places, the sky was a web of electrical lines and cables, bits of wind-blown trash collected against buildings, and the streets in the quarter were lined with slanting and bent rows of no parking signs. As Ryman understood what interested Walt, these elements for the most part were not included in his sketches. His sketches were a vision of New Orleans beauty without its clutter. During the afternoon, after one loop through the historic section of town, Ryman walked alone with Walt. Though he was in his 60s, Walt still moved quickly, filled with optimism and purpose. He looked like an older man, but still had the energy of a younger person. We did see aging, Ryman said, but not to the point of any infirmity. Even when streaks of gray were visible in his hair, Walt was still recognized as the dark-eyed movie producer who hosted the Sunday night TV show. At times, Walt would lightly disguise his appearance by wearing a crumpled hat or an old sweater, clothes that most people wouldn't associate with a TV celebrity. Ryman could tell that today, Walt wished to focus on work as opposed to focusing on the public. But then Ryman noticed 3 female tourists whose eyes collectively took in Walt from across a street. "I hope these women don't want his autograph," Ryman thought. Then he noticed the women crossed the road so that they walked behind them, something that Walt hadn't yet observed. This, Ryman believed, is the end of our peaceful walk because they're going to come over and get his autograph. Ryman, who had worked with stars at other studios, knew how such moments could play out. After a fan invaded a celebrity space hoping for an autograph but instead receiving a stern rebuke. In his mind, he played how this moment would likely end, with Walt politely and firmly sending the women on their way. But Ryman was surprised how Walt reacted when one of the women tapped him on the shoulder. He turned curious, not angry at all. "You're Walt Disney," the woman said. "You don't know me." Playfully, Walt interjected, "Oh, I do now," which made the woman smile and put her at ease. She pointed to her 2 friends, each of whom carried a small autograph book. "Would you mind signing our books?" Walt looked from one woman to the next. "I'd be delighted," he said. He picked an empty page and put his name near the top. He had a habit of signing autograph books in this way so that no one could add a message above it, such as "To my dear friend." While he signed their books, he asked their names, which surprised them. When they left, they glowed with excitement, quickly moving across the street and discussing how lucky they were to find Walt Disney in New Orleans of all places. This was another moment that stayed with Ryman. Unlike other longtime celebrities who now wanted the world to leave them alone, Walt seemed to understand what it meant to people to talk briefly to a person who made movies they had enjoyed. There was a kindness in Walt that exceeded that of many celebrities Ryman had known. Ryman's work on New Orleans Square was some of the best of his career. Not only did he create images that presented how this area would look when finished, he worked inside of a design layout that he had developed. Perhaps because of this, he could imagine the area with greater depth and specificity than in earlier projects. He didn't work on the area alone. He was joined by longtime Disney designers John Hench and Bill Martin, but he functioned as a lead designer who had originated the project. He sketched out shops and houses, outdoor restaurants and parks. As New Orleans was a city filled primarily with two-story structures, the square at Disneyland would be filled with such buildings. He imagined a place where slender doorways led to open courtyards, streets playfully curved like a maze, and restaurants with outdoor dining patios were shaded by awnings and trees. In one pencil drawing, he outlined a row of shops behind which he placed the slender masts of tall ships in the distance. This was a trick he had learned at MGM, that elements like these masts could suggest depth. The masts were sketched at roughly 20% scale to make them appear further away than they were. He roughed out drawings of shop after shop in ink and charcoal, with elegant balconies, vines curving through their railings. He drew a small park with benches and trees as well as a riverside promenade. But his most inviting works were a series of paintings that featured nuns strolling through this new land. These paintings, which were some of the most elegant that Ryman produced for WED, presented New Orleans Square as an idealized American city with couples out for a walk, a plein air painter working with watercolors, couples peering into a shop window, and a woman waiting for her companion on a city bench. Many paintings focused on the pair of nuns, dressed in black habits and French cornets rising lightly on their heads. Nuns walked past the shops, basket in hand. They moved side by side through a public square. They stepped down a staircase inside a courtyard, and they talked to a woman while nearby a man scratched the head of a cat. In this way, Ryman understood what Walt wanted, to remake the old sections of an actual city, sections of Pirates Alley and Jackson Square, rebuilt from the ground up and now perfected in his park. This was Walt's vision of New Orleans, the historic elegance of the city without the clutter of daily life. Maybe this was what Walt's park in places was becoming, the beauty of the outside world without its problems. In New York, the Disney attractions were among the most popular offerings at the fair. For the most part, the Disney attractions were larger in scope and longer in duration than those at Disneyland. Their success clearly demonstrated the public's interest in longer and more immersive ride and show experiences. Each week, Walt sent members of WED and the studio teams out to the fair for a week. Along with their spouses, they flew on the company Gulfstream and stayed in accommodations provided by Disney. In return, Walt wanted to know what they enjoyed about the fair and which elements or experiences they believed might improve Disneyland. One of the largest takeaways concerned ride vehicles. At the fair, Disney designers observed linked vehicle systems that moved guests through a dark ride far more efficiently and at greater guest capacity than the single cars then used at Disneyland on such attractions as Mr. Toad's Wild Ride and Alice in Wonderland. An adaptation of this linked vehicle technology would soon be redesigned at WED as the basis for the Omnimover system. A similar observation was made about the Small World boats, specifically how this system was able to move thousands of guests through the ride each hour, a system far more effective than any ride vehicle system then in use at Disneyland. WED's work with the fair translated into changes for proposed Disneyland attractions. As a result of Small World's high guest throughput, a version of this boat and flume system was arranged into the Pirates attraction, transforming it from a walkthrough into an actual ride. Now that it was a ride, Walt had a way to easily move guests seated in a boat beneath the railroad tracks into a much larger show building that could be built just outside the berm, in a section of open land next to a picnic area. This design allowed Walt to imagine a far larger dark ride, something similar in scope to those rides at the fair. The Ford Magic Skyway lasted over 10 minutes, far longer than any indoor dark ride then at Disneyland. For the reimagining of the Pirates attraction, Walt now wanted a ride that was over 15 minutes long. With that, Walt needed far larger and more detailed plans for its stages. Ryman again was tasked with creating some concepts for this attraction. To create an authentic experience, he flew to San Juan, Puerto Rico, to visit historic parts of the city in another effort to fill Disneyland with designs that connected to real-world locations, not simply to images arranged in film. This, too, expanded the ways that designers used reference material to create attractions in the park. For the second time in a year, Walt asked Ryman to study a real-world location, this time the colonial Spanish forts and streets of Puerto Rico, and adapt his findings for Disneyland. In San Juan, Ryman visited the fort at San Cristobal, which was arranged as a museum depicting its colonial past, complete with living quarters, an armory, small jail cells, and bronze and iron cannons arranged around its wall perimeter. He visited Calle del Cristo with its cobblestone walkways and pastel-toned buildings. He visited an 18th century chapel built with square stone blocks. The front entrance of the chapel, like many entrance areas at the fort, was fortified with iron gates. He walked along the streets beside white buildings with their second-story balconies beneath arched bridges made of stone and past black lampposts rising to small glass boxes of light. He also made a trip to at least one tavern. While in the old city of San Juan, Ryman penciled out sketches of the things he saw, many of which would end up in the designs for the ride. The finished attraction 3 years later would ultimately present a fort opening to a harbor, a city with pastel buildings and wrought iron balconies, and a public marketplace where locals sold goods. The attraction would include the type of jail cells included in Spanish forts, and even those black metal lampposts topped with their rectangular boxes of light that Ryman had observed on Calle del Cristo. Ultimately, the public face of the Pirates design team would be Mark Davis, who managed the character designs, and Claude Coates, who created the environment. But beneath their efforts were Ryman's research and drawings, which brought a heightened sense of realism and authenticity to this attraction. 1964 was a banner year for the Disney Company. Not only did the Disney attractions at the fair prove a hit, but the company found success at the box office. Previous Disney live-action films in the early 1960s had been cost-conscious productions that produced modest profits, with one notable exception: Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins was a worldwide phenomenon, a financial success far larger than any film previously produced by the studio, even that of Snow White. The film brought in mountains of cash from the box office, and in stores the soundtrack album sold millions of copies. It was a success far larger than Walt had imagined, one that allowed him to expand his park in California, specifically a complete redo of Tomorrowland. It also allowed him to greatly expand his vision for Florida. Initially, when Walt and Roy asked Disney lawyer Bob Foster to quietly identify and buy land in Central Florida, they specified a unified plot of between 5,000 and 10,000 acres, an area large enough for a new theme park, a few hotels, and an outdoor recreation area, ideally situated around a lake. But with the additional money from Mary Poppins, Walt now wanted an even larger chunk of Florida real estate, a parcel that, bit by bit, grew to 27,000 acres, something roughly the size of San Francisco. This geographic canvas would give Walt even more space to dream, to develop ideas that he was only then beginning to consider. Projects that would include Ryman as one of the key people, an artist who created paintings and drawings to express with specificity and color the images that hazily appeared in Walt's mind. I'll be back next week with a new show. I realize that this is the first week of November presently, but the Disney earnings report and call will be this coming Wednesday, November 8th, so I wanted to wait until that information was released before exploring the current state of the company, the studios, and the parks. We'll simply have a more robust episode after that information is out there. But we'll do that next Sunday, also with an exploration of what's new and changing at the parks. Next, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, by listeners who sign up to become monthly Bandcamp subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes that are not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly Bandcamp subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.